My parents said, "We need a quiet Christmas this year." Quiet. That's what they called cutting me out after 12 years of hosting every single one. So I stayed quiet too, until the cameras showed up at my house. 50 homeless guests, one massive dinner, and the same parents, watching it all on national TV. They wanted silence. I gave them a story the world would never forget. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The first morning of December always feels the same in Santa Monica, gray clouds hanging low, the ocean air damp and cold enough to sting your skin a little. I had the house heater running and cinnamon candles lit the same way I always did when I started preparing for Christmas. My hands were full with lists, guest names, menus, gift bags, the kind of details that used to make my parents proud, or so I thought. I stood in the middle of my old living room, sunlight slipping through the blinds, landing softly on the red ribbons and empty boxes stacked by the fireplace. For 12 years, this house had been the center of our family's Christmas. I hosted every year since I was 27, ever since my parents said, "Grace, you're the only one with space big enough for all of us." I took that as a responsibility, a badge of honor. The phone on the counter buzzed. I smiled, expecting my mom to text me a new dessert request, or maybe ask what time dinner would start this year. Instead, I froze when I read the words. "We won't be coming this year. You don't need to host. Everyone just wants a peaceful Christmas." The message came from Mom. Helen Whitmore, always polished, always careful with her words, but somehow every one of them cut like glass. For a second, I thought I misread it. Then, before I could even breathe, another message popped up. "Don't overreact, Grace. This is a family decision." "Dad." The room went quiet, heavy, as if the air had thickened. I sat down slowly, staring at the phone still glowing on the table. The sound of the ocean outside felt distant. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. 12 years, 12 winters of cooking, decorating, hosting, fixing, 12 years of building something that apparently no one wanted anymore. I picked up the phone again, reread the words, half expecting them to change. They didn't. A bitter laugh slipped out before I could stop it. I poured myself a glass of wine from the half-open bottle in the cabinet, my hand shaking slightly. The smell of oak and fruit filled the room, mixing with the cold air. I took a sip and walked toward the big picture window overlooking the front yard. The trees were bare now, the fountain turned off for the season. My reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, tired, pale, but oddly calm. For years I had made this house sparkle. Crystal ornaments, golden garlands, custom centerpieces. Every guest marveled at the attention to detail. My mother used to brag to her friends, "Grace has a gift for presentation." But when the party ended, she would sigh, "You always go a little overboard, don't you?" It was never enough. I was never enough. I pulled out the box of decorations from the closet and opened the lid. The scent of pine and dust hit me. Inside were hundreds of memories, handmade ornaments, the little angel that always topped the tree, a ribbon I bought the year my father's business recovered. I held one up, a glass snowflake etched with Family Christmas 2015, and laughed softly. "Guess we're retiring the brand," I murmured. My mind drifted back, flash after flash of past Christmases. The loud dinners, the perfect table settings, my father pouring wine while Mom smiled for photos. Laura, my sister always in red, always glowing. And me, behind the scenes, making sure the roast didn't burn, the lights stayed on, the guests were entertained. When the pictures were printed, I was barely in any of them. A shadow at the edge of the frame, always holding something. A tray, a dish, a to-do list. I took another sip of wine and sat down on the couch. My phone buzzed again this time with a message from Laura. "Don't take it personally. Grace, Mom just wants things calm this year." Calm. That word again. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't type back. What was there to say? Calm was never the problem. Silence was. The old clock ticked. Outside, a breeze rattled the front gate. I could almost hear my mother's voice in my head. "It's not that we don't appreciate you, dear. It's just, sometimes you make things too intense. Too intense." That was her phrase for everything I did when I restored this Victorian house on my own. Intense. When I started my event design company. Intense. When I wanted every holiday to feel magical. Intense. I stood feeling a strange stillness wash over me. Maybe they were right. I was intense. Maybe that was exactly what they couldn't handle. I looked at the phone one last time. The screen had gone dark. My reflection stared back at me, steadier now. If they want peace, I whispered, setting the phone face down on the table. I'll give them peace, just not the kind they expect. I drained the glass, placed it on the counter, and turned off the lights. The house sank into quiet, the kind that hums right before something changes. The clock struck 9, echoing through the empty rooms. For the first time in 12 years, I didn't write a shopping list. I just sat there letting the silence settle in, wondering what peace could possibly mean when it didn't include me. Outside, the ocean kept moving waves against the sand, steady and unstoppable. By late afternoon, the rain had started, a quiet, steady drizzle that made the air smell like wet pine and salt from the ocean. I pulled an old photo box from the cabinet and spread the pictures across the dining table. Years of Christmases stared back at me in glossy color. My mother Helen always perfectly composed. My father Robert with his practiced smile and his glass of wine held high. Laura, my sister, glowing next to her husband Evan. And me, barely visible, sometimes just a blur in the background, sometimes just my hand pouring champagne. I traced the edge of one photo with my finger, remembering exactly what song was playing that night, the way the lights shimmered across the silverware. I had spent 2 days polishing every spoon, ironing every napkin. They called it perfect, but no one ever thought to ask if I'd sat down long enough to eat. I picked up another picture from 2010, the year everything fell apart. My father's real estate business crashed almost overnight. The calls stopped. Friends disappeared. My mother cried quietly in her study, saying, "People only love you when they think you're still worth something." That December, she wanted to cancel Christmas. It would look pathetic, she said, but I didn't let her. I used my entire savings, every dollar I had from my first year as an event planner, to host a dinner that made it look like we were still thriving. I remember standing by the oven, sweat on my face, shaking with exhaustion, while my mother smiled for the guests and said, "Grace just loves to help." She never told anyone I paid for everything. The memory still burned. I poured myself another glass of wine, leaned back, and turned on the old jazz playlist I used to play while setting up the house. It filled the empty space softly, like a ghost from better years. I used to think I was building something that mattered, a tradition, a legacy, a reason for them to be proud. Now I knew better. I wasn't building a legacy. I was building a mask for them to wear in front of the world. The phone rang. My heart jumped when I saw her name flash across the screen. For a moment, I thought she might have changed her mind. I pressed accept. Grace. My mother's voice came through firm, rehearsed. "Don't overreact to the message this morning. You always take things so personally." "Do I said quietly. She sighed. "You have to understand your father and I are getting older. We just want a simple Christmas this year." "Simple," I repeated, meaning one without me. There was a long silence. I could hear her breathing, the faint hum of a TV in the background. "You always make things intense," she said finally. "This isn't about you." "Of course it's about me," I said softly. "You texted me to cancel Christmas. I'm the only one who ever hosts it." Another pause. "Grace, I don't want to argue. You know how your father feels about drama." "That's the problem, Mom," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You all act like love is drama." I could almost hear her straighten in her chair. "This is exactly why we need a quiet holiday." And then she hung up. I stared at the phone, the call screen fading into black. I set it down and leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. The jazz played on, scratchy and warm, like it didn't care that the world had just shifted under my feet. The house was darker now. I reached over and turned on a small lamp. Its soft glow spilled across the photographs, lighting up the smiles that weren't real. I picked one up from last year. Laura and Evan standing beside the tree, my parents in the middle, all grinning. And behind them, through the reflection in the window, I could see myself holding the camera. The only time I appeared was when I took the picture. I took a long sip of wine, feeling it burn down my throat. "I'm not losing them," I whispered to the room. "They're losing me." Outside, the rain turned heavier, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. I got up and closed the blinds, shutting out the gray sky. The house was quiet again, except for the faint sound of the ocean a few blocks away. I sat on the floor, surrounded by pictures, and let the silence press against me. For the first time in years, there was no checklist, no timer beeping from the kitchen, no voice asking if the turkey was overdone. Just me and the truth settling in. They had always been so proud of appearances, so terrified of being less than perfect. And I had spent 12 years trying to make them feel flawless, even when it broke me. I reached for one last photograph. The one from the first Christmas I ever hosted, 2012. The tree sparkled like a magazine cover. Everyone looked happy. I remember standing at the edge of the room that night hearing my father say, "Now this is what a Whitmore Christmas should look like." And for a second I believed him. The memory faded, replaced by the soft creak of the old house. I turned off the lamp, leaving the table scattered with frozen smiles. The light from the window cast long shadows over the photos, stretching them into something unrecognizable. I sat there in the half-dark, listening to the rain, and let myself smile. Small, tired, but certain. For once, I wasn't sad. I was free. The next morning, the fog still clung to the coast like a blanket when I pulled into the small parking lot of Blue Horizon Cafe. It was early enough that the windows were fogged over from the steam inside. I pushed open the door, and the bell above it gave a soft chime. The smell of roasted beans and salt air mixed in a way that felt grounding. Olivia was already there, sitting in the corner booth by the window, 2 cappuccinos on the table. She always ordered for both of us, one with extra foam, one black. She knew which was mine. I slid into the seat across from her. "You look like you haven't slept," she said, studying me with those sharp brown eyes that always seemed to see right through everything. "I haven't," I said, forcing a small laugh. "I was thinking about everything." She didn't ask which everything. Olivia had known me for years, since the days when my company Whitmore Creative was still a home-based idea, scribbled on post-it notes. She'd seen me chase perfection like it was oxygen. I told her about the text, about my mother's tone, about the word peace. The word itself made me want to laugh. How something so small could hold so much rejection. Olivia didn't interrupt. She just listened the way she always did, elbows on the table, her cappuccino untouched. When I finished, she leaned back and sighed. Sometimes she said softly, "People have to lose something they thought they owned to realize it was never really theirs." I blinked at her. "You think they feel like they owned me?" I think she said. "They don't know who you are without what you do for them, and that scares them." Her words sank deep, quiet, and painful. I looked out the fogged window. The beach was just across the road, pale gray, under a thin layer of morning mist. The waves rolled in slowly, steady and patient, like time itself. I said, "You know, for 12 years I thought if I just made everything perfect, they'd finally see me. Turns out they liked me invisible." She nodded. "So maybe it's time someone else gets to see you." I gave her a confused look. She smiled, the kind of smile that meant she'd already made up her mind. "What if you host Christmas anyway?" "Just not for them. We have 50 residents at the Santa Monica Community Shelter who have nowhere to go. You have a house. I have the network. We could do something real." Her words caught me off guard. I blinked, imagining it, my dining room filled with strangers instead of polished guests, laughter instead of criticism, people who didn't expect anything but warmth. I hesitated. 50 people, she nodded. 50 people who haven't had a holiday meal in years. "I can handle the logistics," volunteers, "the van transport. You handle what you're good at, turning space into something beautiful." I stared down at my hands, still cold from outside. The idea felt impossible and exactly right at the same time. "You think this would actually work?" "I think," she said, "it's the first time in a long time I've seen a spark in your eyes when you talk about Christmas." I looked up at her, and she wasn't wrong. Something small but certain flickered inside me, the part of me that had been buried under years of trying to please them. I turned to look out the window again. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the blue line of the ocean. "All right," I said quietly. "Let's do it." Olivia smiled, reached across the table, and placed her hand over mine. "I'll call the shelter this afternoon. We'll make it happen." I took a deep breath, then pulled my phone from my bag. "There's one more person I should talk to." She raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "Evan," I said. "He knows the city permit system. If I'm going to open my home to 50 people, I'll need it to be legal." I stepped outside to make the call. The wind hit my face hard, salty and cool. Cars hummed along the Pacific Coast Highway, and seagulls circled above the rooftops. I dialed his number. He answered quickly. "Grace, everything okay?" Hey, Evan, I said. Do you still have contacts at the city permit office? There was a pause. Yeah, why I need to file for a temporary event permit. I'm hosting a Christmas dinner. He sounded confused. Hosting. I thought the family decided. They did. I interrupted. But this isn't for them. Then who? I looked out at the water, where sunlight had just broken through the clouds, glinting off the surface. For people who don't have anyone. 50 guests, maybe more. Another pause. Grace, that's a big thing to pull off. The media will notice. Are you ready for that? I smiled to myself. I'm tired of being quiet, Evan. If they want me invisible, they're about to see me everywhere. He exhaled. All right, I'll email you the paperwork. Just promise me one thing. Don't let this turn into something that hurts you. I won't, I said softly. This isn't about revenge. It's about meaning. When I hung up, the wind caught my hair, tossing it around my face. The clouds were gone now, replaced by a bright winter sun. The sea sparkled like a mirror, alive and endless. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I turned back toward the cafe window, saw Olivia still sitting there, smiling at me from behind the glass. I raised my hand in a small wave, then walked toward my car. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I looked in the rearview mirror at the cafe shrinking behind me. The road ahead curved along the coastline, sunlight spilling over the asphalt. 12 years of being the good daughter, the perfect hostess, the quiet one. That version of me ended with a text. Whatever came next, it would have my name on it. The next morning, I found myself standing in the crowded hallway of Santa Monica City Hall, clutching a thick folder of papers. Olivia walked beside me, calm as always, her coffee in one hand and a confident smile on her face. The building smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. The kind of place where hope and bureaucracy met and rarely got along. We took a number and waited under flickering fluorescent lights until a city clerk called us forward. Event permit applications are handled by the mayor's office, the clerk said. Barely looking up, room 214. Olivia thanked her and nudged me forward. We climbed a narrow staircase lined with bulletin boards filled with flyers, lost pets, town meetings, bake sales. I couldn't help but think how small my big idea suddenly felt. Mayor Diane Lopez greeted us in her office, a space full of sunlight and the smell of lemon-scented polish. She was in her mid-50s, sharp-eyed, but warm. Her desk was stacked with city reports, a framed photo of her family tucked in the corner. Ms. Whitmore, she said, shaking my hand. I've heard about your event. An open Christmas dinner for the homeless. Admirable idea. I smiled cautiously. Thank you, Mayor Lopez. I want to do it right with permits and insurance. She nodded, pulling a form from her folder. I'm glad to hear that. We support community events, but the law is the law. You'll need a temporary event permit, proof of liability insurance, and documentation for food safety compliance. And a list of volunteers. Understood. I said quickly, I can get everything in 48 hours. She glanced up. That's ambitious. Olivia leaned forward. She's good at ambitious. The mayor smiled slightly. I can tell. We left her office, my heart pounding. As we stepped into the courtyard outside City Hall, the midday sun hit hard. That's when I saw her. Karen Douglas, the owner of Seaside Fine Dining, standing near the fountain with her phone pressed to her ear. She spotted us immediately and ended the call. Grace Whitmore, she said, walking over her heels, clicking against the pavement. I heard you're planning to turn your fancy old house into a homeless shelter for Christmas. It's not a shelter, I said evenly. It's one night, a dinner. Karen crossed her arms, her diamond bracelet catching the light. You realize my restaurant is 2 blocks away. My guests don't pay top dollar to eat, while people line up for free food down the street. Olivia stepped in, smiling politely. Then maybe you'll have extra room for compassion on the menu. Karen narrowed her eyes. Cute. But when the city gets complaints, don't say I didn't warn you. She turned sharply and walked away, her perfume lingering like smoke. I exhaled slowly. Olivia muttered, that woman could make Santa himself lose patience. She'll come around, I said, though I didn't believe it. By late afternoon, I was back home surrounded by papers spread across my kitchen table. Permit forms, insurance, quotes, food safety guidelines. The phone buzzed. Laura. I almost didn't answer, but something in me wanted to know how far the family gossip had traveled. Grace, she said the moment I picked up. Mom and Dad know. They think you're doing this to embarrass them. I laughed under my breath. Of course they do. Grace, be serious. Mom said people will think she raised an attention seeker. You know how she feels about appearances. I know exactly how she feels, I said quietly. That's why I stopped living my life around them. Can't you just... Laura, I interrupted. If kindness looks like revenge to them, then yes, I guess I'm guilty. She was silent for a moment. You have no idea how scared Mom is of losing face. Then maybe, I said, it's time she learns what love looks like without a camera flashing. There was another long pause. When she finally spoke, her voice softened. You always were the brave one. I'm just tired, I said. Tired of pretending peace means silence. After we hung up, I sat at the table, staring at the blank space on the permit form where my signature would go. The house felt big and quiet around me. Outside, the late afternoon light spilled across the porch. I walked out to the front yard, grabbed a small wooden board from the shed, and painted the words carefully, one brushstroke at a time. Christmas Eve, dinner, open for all. The paint was still wet when I propped it against the white fence. The wind from the ocean brushed across my face cold and clean. Sometimes peace doesn't come from silence. It comes from doing something loud enough that people finally have to listen. I went back inside and poured a cup of tea, watching from the window as the sign gleamed in the fading sun. By evening, my inbox was full. Messages from volunteers, old clients, even strangers who'd seen a post Olivia shared online about our plan. But tucked between them was one email that made me stop. It was from the Santa Monica City Clerk's office, notice of formal complaint filed, Seaside Fine Dining versus Whitmore Residence Event, Karen. I stared at the screen, the corners of my mouth curling into a tired smile. Of course, by midnight, local bloggers had already picked up the story. Designer plans, Christmas feast for homeless, neighbors divided. Photos of my house were everywhere. I turned off the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and closed my eyes. Let them talk. Let them argue. I'd spent 12 years trying to make my family's Christmas look perfect. Maybe it was time to make one that actually meant something. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a soft orange-gray, the kind of light that makes the whole city feel quiet. I parked near St. Agnes Church, clutching 2 cups of coffee and a folded blanket. The air was cold enough that my breath came out in clouds. I'd started doing this, bringing coffee to the park, whenever I needed to think. The benches there had become my version of confession. Near the fountain, I noticed an older man sitting alone, reading a worn paperback. His coat was too thin for the weather, his hair a mess of silver curls that caught the dying light. The book in his hands was Great Expectations. Somehow that felt poetic. I walked over slowly, the gravel crunching under my boots. Evening, I said softly, holding out one of the cups. I brought an extra. It's still hot. He looked up, eyes bright blue and surprisingly sharp. Who are you? He asked, voice raspy but kind. That brings coffee to strangers. I smiled. Someone else who doesn't fit where she used to. He studied me for a long second, then took the cup. Well, he said that's as good a reason as any. I sat down at the far end of the bench, the air thick with the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. He took a sip and closed his eyes like it was the best thing he'd had all day. I'm Grace, I said after a while. Whitmore. He opened his eyes, and something changed in them. Recognition, maybe. Whitmore, he repeated quietly. That name's familiar. I nodded, waiting. I used to teach, he said slowly, tapping his thumb against the book cover. At Santa Monica High. Long time ago. I had a student. No, not a student. A parent. Robert Whitmore. The sound of my father's name made my stomach tighten. My father, I said carefully. He nodded once. Figures. I hesitated. You knew him. Knew him, he said with a dry laugh. He was the reason I stopped teaching. I filed a report about a funding issue at his real estate foundation. I thought it was my duty. 2 weeks later, I was let go. Downsizing, they said. He looked out across the park. I was naive enough to believe good people always tell the truth. The wind picked up, tossing dry leaves across the path. I didn't know what to say. My father had never mentioned anything like this. I thought back to those years, 2010, when the market collapsed, and Dad came home angry every night. I remembered him saying, people will try to drag you down when you're successful. I never asked what he meant. He glanced at me again, reading my face. Didn't mean to make things awkward. "I'm Leonard Harris," he said. "These days I read I walk, and I try not to hate the man who signed that paper." I swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," I said. "For what happened. And for what my father did." He shrugged. "We all fall somewhere between right and wrong, Miss Whitmore. The trick is where we decide to stop." Something about his voice, his calm acceptance, hit me deep. I felt that same mix of guilt and defiance I'd been carrying since the text message. "I'm organizing a Christmas dinner," I said suddenly, "for people who don't have anywhere to go. At my house." He blinked at me. "You're serious, I am." He tilted his head. "And why are you telling me this?" I smiled. "Because you're invited, and I think you should sit at the head of the table." He looked at me like he was trying to decide whether I was joking. When he realized I wasn't, his face softened. "You don't even know me. Maybe not." I said, "But I think I was meant to." The church bells rang in the distance, the sound rolling through the cold air. He nodded slowly. "Then I'll be there. Thank you, Grace." I stood up, brushed the dust from my coat, and handed him a folded invitation card from my bag. It had gold letters, simple, but warm. He turned it over in his hand. "This looks like the kind of thing you'd give to a governor." "Or someone who deserves one," I said, and started walking back toward my car. When I got home, the house felt too big, too clean. I went straight to my office, where rows of neatly labeled folders lined the shelves. I pulled out an old binder labeled 2010, Legal. It was full of receipts, project notes, and letters from my father's company. Near the back, I found it. A copy of a termination form signed by Robert Whitmore. The name at the top, Leonard Harris. Reason for termination. Breach of confidentiality. I sat down at my desk, staring at the signature. The ink had faded, but the shape of his handwriting was still strong, proud, final. I laughed quietly to myself. One of those laughs that comes out when something hurts too much to cry about. All this time I whispered, and Justice was sitting in my storage cabinet. I set the paper down beside one of my new invitations, the gold lettering shining under the lamp. 2 pieces of the same story. The past and the present finally facing each other. The heater hummed in the corner. Outside, the sky had gone from orange to indigo. Somewhere, far away, a siren wailed, the city going on, as if nothing had changed. But for me, something had. Maybe it wasn't about revenge anymore. Maybe it was about balance, about making something right, even if it took 12 years and one cold December night to do it. I folded the termination letter, placed it in a small box, and closed the lid. Then I went to the window, looking out at the empty street below. The wind rattled the Christmas Eve dinner, open for all sign on the gate, the paint still drying. I smiled faintly. Sometimes justice doesn't come when you want it. Sometimes it shows up in the form of an old man on a park bench with a book called Great Expectations. At the country club in Brentwood, the world always felt frozen in place. Polished wood, white tablecloths, quiet laughter that never reached the eyes. My parents fit there perfectly, like 2 framed portraits that had learned to smile on command. That Friday, they were having lunch with their usual circle. 3 couples from the old real estate network, the kind of people who still referred to the recession as that little dip. Laura sat beside them, her hair tied neatly, her hands folded in her lap. A young woman with a press badge approached the table, notebook in hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," she said, polite but eager. "I'm Megan from the Santa Monica Gazette. Could I get a quick quote about your daughter's event?" Robert's jaw tightened. Event. "The Christmas dinner she's organizing for the homeless," the reporter said. "It's been making the rounds online. Quite a story." My father leaned back in his chair, his expression cold. "Grace doesn't represent us," he said. "She's doing whatever she thinks she needs to do." Helen's tone was smoother, the kind of gentle cruelty only she could manage. "Our daughter is passionate. Sometimes a little too much. I'm sure her intentions are good, even if her execution is a bit dramatic." Laura looked down at her water glass, swirling the straw. The reporter scribbled, thanked them, and walked away. No one spoke for a full minute. Then one of Robert's friends chuckled. She always did have a flair for spectacle. My father forced a laugh. Runs in the blood, I suppose. But Helen didn't laugh. She kept staring at her plate, her knife trembling slightly as she cut through the salmon. When I think of them now, I hear my own voice somewhere in the background, cutting through the noise. When they said peace, what they really meant was, don't let anyone see the cracks. Later that afternoon, back in Santa Monica, I was at my office at Whitmore Creative reviewing lighting designs for the event when my assistant buzzed through. "There's a Mr. Grant here to see you. Miles Grant from the Los Angeles Herald." I hesitated, then said, "Send him in." He walked in wearing a dark jacket, hair slightly messy, carrying a leather-bound notebook. His handshake was firm but cool, like someone used to walking into rooms where he wasn't welcome. "Ms. Whitmore," he said. "Thanks for taking the time. I'll get straight to it. You're planning to open your home to 50 homeless guests on Christmas Eve?" "Yes," I said. "We've secured the permits and food licenses. It's all above board." He nodded. "I'm sure it is. But may I ask what made you decide to do this now?" "Some people might say it's a little convenient." "Convenient," I repeated. "In what way?" He glanced down at his notes. "Given the Whitmore name's connection to past controversies, your father's financial issues, the lawsuits, it could look like you're trying to rebrand the family image." I felt the old familiar sting in my chest, the kind that used to make me defend him automatically, but not this time. "I'm not interested in rewriting the past," I said evenly. "I'm just writing a better present." That made him look up. His eyes softened slightly, but only for a second. "Fair enough," he said. "May I take photos of the preparations?" "Not yet," I said. "You'll get your story when there's something worth seeing." He nodded, jotted something down, and left. By the time night fell, my phone was buzzing non-stop. Olivia texted, "Check the Herald online." I opened the link and saw the headline, "Designer Grace Whitmore hosts free Christmas dinner. Compassion or clever publicity." The photo they used wasn't mine. It was one of me from a charity gala 3 years ago, champagne glass in hand, smiling under chandeliers. The irony stung. I clicked the comments section and skimmed through the chaos. "She's just doing damage control for her family name. Maybe she actually means it. Don't judge too fast. Wish more rich people did this instead of pretending they care." I turned off my phone. The ocean outside my window looked endless, black waves crashing against the rocks. I could hear the hum of the city far below, a mix of traffic and holiday music leaking from bars. The phone rang again. Olivia. "You okay?" she asked immediately. I hesitated before answering. "They think I'm faking it. Let them think," she said. "The people who need to believe will see the truth when it's time." I smiled faintly. "You always sound so sure." "Because I've seen it happen. The right story always wins, even if it takes a while." After we hung up, I walked out to the balcony, wrapping my sweater tighter around me. The salt air was cold sharp. Below, Christmas lights blinked along the street, soft and out of rhythm. They can doubt me all they want, but they won't be able to ignore me. Somewhere across town, my father was holding that same paper. I could picture him at the head of the table, the article trembling in his hands, as he read my name in bold print. "What the hell is she doing?" he'd ask, and Helen, sitting beside him, would say nothing, her gaze fixed on the headline, like it might burn through the page. He'd slam the paper down, his voice sharp enough to cut through glass. "She's dragging us through the mud." And she'd look at him quietly just for a moment before saying the words she didn't mean to let slip. Maybe the mud isn't where the dirt started. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was the night air, the sound of the tide, and the small, defiant calm inside me that whispered, this was only the beginning. Monday morning came with the kind of sunlight that felt too bright, the kind that exposes everything you'd rather keep hidden. I was in the backyard, setting up tables with the volunteers, checking the tablecloths, arranging candles, when Hannah came running out from the kitchen, her phone in hand and her face pale. "Grace," she said, breathless, "you need to see this." On her screen was a video, shot from across the street through the iron gates of my property. The angle was shaky, but clear enough to show me directing people laughing with Olivia carrying trays of decorations. The caption read, "Wealthy woman turns mansion into homeless dinner venue. PR stunt or real compassion." It had over 200,000 views. I took the phone, watched the short clip play again. Someone had caught the exact moment I lifted a centerpiece and smiled. It looked cinematic staged, even though it wasn't. The comments were already flooding in. "She's just trying to fix her image. Why does kindness bother you so much? She's probably getting paid for this. She's an angel." I scrolled until my thumb ached. My face didn't change, but something inside me twisted. A quiet ache that wasn't quite anger, but not sadness either. I handed the phone back to Hannah. "Let them talk," I said. "But it's everywhere," she whispered. "TikTok, Facebook, local news. They're saying your neighborhood is protesting the event." Olivia stepped outside, her phone pressed to her ear. "We're already getting calls," she said. "Reporters want interviews. The city council wants updated permits. They say there's a complaint about crowd control and food safety. I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying myself. How long do we have? 48 hours, she said. If we don't provide documentation, they can shut the whole thing down. I took a deep breath. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and pine through the open doors. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear church bells from St. Agnes. I looked around at the tables we'd set up, half-finished and glowing under the morning light. We'll get the papers. We'll do this right. Olivia frowned. Grace, be careful. They're looking for a reason to say you failed. I know. I said quietly, but they'll have to look harder. By late afternoon, the story had made it to the evening broadcast. The headline flashed across the TV in my kitchen. Neighborhood split over charity event in Santa Monica. And there she was, Karen Douglas, standing in front of her restaurant, microphone in hand, wearing a crisp white suit. We all support helping the less fortunate, she said, but there's a right way to do it. Bringing dozens of homeless individuals into a residential area creates safety and sanitation concerns. My customers already feel uncomfortable. It's unfair to local businesses. The clip cut to a shot of me smiling in the leaked video again, like they wanted the audience to decide which of us looked more believable. Olivia muted the TV. She's making you the villain. I sat down at the table, feeling the wood cool under my palms. That's fine, I said. Every story needs one. My inbox pinged again. An email from the city clerk's office. The subject line made my stomach drop. Permit review pending. Additional requirements needed. They wanted confirmation of liability insurance, a health inspection report, and a written safety plan for crowd management, all within 2 days. When Hannah saw my face, she panicked. Oh my God, we can't do all that in time. We can't, I said. We have to. She shook her head. The news says someone's already threatening a lawsuit. They said if one thing goes wrong. I cut her off gently. No one sues kindness, Hannah. They sue mistakes. We just won't make any. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the waves of light reflecting off the ocean. My house, looked both stronger and lonelier than ever. I'd spent most of my life trying to make people comfortable. Now I realized sometimes doing good meant making them uncomfortable first. That night, Olivia stayed over to help me draft the documents. We spread papers across the living room floor. Checklists, diagrams, sample contracts. The fire burned low in the hearth. She looked up at me at one point, tired, but smiling. You know, she said, this is the first time I've seen you calm under pressure. I'm not calm, I said, writing another note. I'm just done being afraid. Just after midnight, when the wind was rattling the window frames, headlights flashed outside. I went to the door, expecting maybe another reporter. Instead, it was Evan, Laura's husband, holding a leather portfolio and a tired grin. He stepped inside, brushing the rain off his shoulders. I figured you might need a lawyer. I almost laughed. You heard. Of course I heard. It's all over the city group chats. He opened the folder and handed me several sheets of paper. Here, temporary event permit approved and signed by the city clerk. Liability insurance confirmed. Health inspection, fast-tracked by a friend who owes me a favor. I stared at the documents, barely believing it. Evan. I don't know what to say. He smiled, that calm, steady look he always had. Say you'll stop worrying. You're official now. Something warm rose in my chest, the first real relief I'd felt in days. Thank you, I said quietly, for believing in this. He shrugged. You're doing something good, Grace. The city just needed someone to remind them what that looks like. After he left, I sat down with the papers spread across my lap. The stamps and signatures gleamed under the lamplight like small victories. I thought about how quickly people could turn kindness into suspicion, how easy it was for generosity to look like ambition. But I also thought about the people who showed up when things got hard. Olivia, Hannah, Evan. The ones who didn't need convincing. When you hold your ground long enough, the right people find their way to you. The house was silent except for the hum of the heater and the soft sound of waves outside. I leaned back in the chair, the documents still in my hands, and whispered to myself, We're doing this. The words felt steady, final, like the click of a door that had just locked in place on the right side of history. By the morning of December 23rd, my house no longer looked like a house. It looked like a small miracle in progress. Every window glowed with warm light, the front yard lined with tables, and the scent of cinnamon and roasted apples drifted through the air. Hannah was in the kitchen arranging flowers, humming a Christmas tune off-key, while a few volunteers carried folding chairs out to the lawn. In the living room stood the centerpiece of everything, the Hope Tree. We'd set it up where my old crystal tree used to go, right in front of the bay window. Each branch was covered in small handmade ornaments, and hanging from them were 50 white cards, each one handwritten by one of our guests from the shelter. I wish I could see my daughter again. I wish for a new pair of shoes. I wish someone would call me by my name. Simple words, but heavy enough to pull tears from anyone who stopped to read them. I stood there for a moment, touching one of the cards lightly between my fingers. I'd spent 12 years making Christmas beautiful for people who already had everything. For the first time, I felt like I was making it mean something. Behind me, a soft voice said, "It's even better in person." I turned to see Mr. Harris standing in the doorway, wearing his old wool coat and a gentle smile. "You weren't kidding," he said. "You've turned this place into something out of a storybook." "Not quite," I said, smiling. "It's still missing a few details." I walked to the coat rack and pulled down a suit bag. "I thought maybe you could help me fix that." He looked puzzled until I unzipped the bag and showed him the contents in one of my father's tailored suits. Charcoal gray, still in perfect condition. "It's an old one," I said, "but I think it'll fit you." His eyes softened as he ran his hand over the fabric. "Grace, this is too much." "It's not," I said quietly. "It's about time something went right for you." He nodded slowly. "I'll wear it tomorrow. I'll try to do it justice." "You already do," I said. Olivia appeared then, carrying her ever-present clipboard. "Good news and bad news," she announced. "Good news. We have all the food donations confirmed. We've got enough turkey pie and cider to feed 70 if we need to. And the bad news, I asked, though, I already had a guess. Karen Douglas." Olivia said, rolling her eyes. "She's on Channel 7 right now, telling a reporter your event is causing disturbances in the neighborhood. Apparently, she claims traffic's been blocked by delivery trucks." Hannah snorted from the kitchen. "Traffic's always blocked. It's Santa Monica in December." I shrugged. "Let her talk. When the cameras come here tomorrow, they'll see the truth." Olivia grinned. "You're becoming immune to her." "I'm impressed. I just stopped giving her the power to define me," I said. "Took me long enough." By sunset, the volunteers had left, and the house glowed with golden lights. The tables outside were covered the trees strung with lanterns that swayed gently in the evening breeze. I was wrapping utensils in napkins when headlights swept across the driveway. Laura's car. I hadn't expected her. She stepped out, holding a small bakery box in both hands. Her hair was pulled back, her coat buttoned tight, like she'd come straight from work. "Hi," she said cautiously. "Hi," I said back, keeping my voice even. She glanced around at the setup. "You weren't exaggerating. This is big enough to make a few people nervous," I said, trying not to sound bitter. She gave a small forced laugh, then held out the box. "I brought Mom's apple pie recipe. I thought maybe—" Her voice trailed off. "Thanks," I said, taking it from her. "That's nice of you." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she sighed. "Grace, you're making this really hard for them." I looked up. "For who?" "For Mom and Dad," she said quickly. "They can't sleep. Mom said she feels like everyone's judging her for how you turned out. They think you're trying to make them look bad." I set the box down gently. "If helping people makes them look bad, maybe they should ask themselves why." Her face tightened. "You always have to be the one making a point, don't you?" "Maybe," I said, "because someone in this family has to." For a moment, I saw the old Laura. The one who always sided with Mom, who believed keeping quiet was easier. But then her shoulders dropped, her voice softer now. "You know what? Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been too afraid to choose a side." I looked at her surprised. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "For not speaking up. For pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I felt something in me ease." "No one's wrong if they decide to fix it," I said. "And for what it's worth, you're welcome to stay. We could use an extra pair of hands." She smiled faintly. "I was hoping you'd say that." We spent the next hour stringing lights around the porch together. It was almost easy, like when we were kids decorating our first Christmas tree in the old house, before everything became about appearances. Every now and then she'd laugh quietly, the sound warm and real. As we worked, she said, "You know Mom and Dad canceled their Napa trip." I turned to her, eyebrows raised. "They did." "Yeah," she said, tying a ribbon. "They're still in L.A. I think they just want to see what happens." I chuckled. So curiosity finally beat pride. "Something like that," she said. I hung the last string of lights and stepped back to look at the house. The glow reflected off the windows, soft and steady. "Good," I said finally. "At least they're still interested in something decent." Laura leaned against the porch railing looking at the lights. You know, she said Mom used to say peace came from keeping things quiet. I think maybe peace comes from finally being honest. I nodded slowly. Maybe it's both. Inside the hope tree shimmered against the glass, its ornaments glinting like tiny stars. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was performing. I was just living. Messy, imperfect, but true. And as the night deepened and the house settled into silence, I realized something I hadn't let myself admit before. I didn't need their approval. I just needed to be seen for who I really was. Sometimes what we crave isn't permission, it's recognition. By the afternoon of December 24th, the sky had turned a soft silver rain drifting down in thin sheets that sparkled against the Christmas lights. The scent of pine and roasted turkey filled the air, mixing with the salt from the nearby ocean. I stood by the front gate in my red wool coat, white scarf wrapped tight around my neck, watching as the first guests arrived. Olivia had arranged for buses from the Santa Monica shelter. They pulled up one by one, each door opening to faces that carried both exhaustion and disbelief. Some of them clutched plastic bags with all they owned inside. Others came empty-handed, their eyes wide as they looked at the glowing house. Beside me, Mr. Harris held an umbrella, his suit pressed neatly, the one I had given him. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked, a trace of humor in his voice. "I've been ready for 12 years, I said, smiling. When the first man stepped forward, I greeted him with a handshake. "Welcome to my home." "Merry Christmas." One by one they came through the gate, men, women, a few children bundled in mismatched coats. Hannah stood near the porch handing out hot cocoa. Olivia organized the seating outside under the canopy where tables shimmered with candles and evergreen garlands. A small jazz trio from the boardwalk played "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," their instruments misted by the light rain. I looked around and felt something shift deep inside me. This wasn't charity. It was connection. Miles Grant was there too, standing in the far corner with his camera crew from Herald TV. He caught my eye briefly and gave a nod, no words, just quiet acknowledgement. As the tables filled, laughter began to ripple through the space, soft at first, then louder. For a group of people used to being invisible, the sound of joy came slowly, like a language they'd forgotten how to speak. A little girl no more than 8 stood near the hope tree, in the living room, staring up at the white cards swaying gently. She wore a coat that was 2 sizes too small. I walked over, crouched down, and handed her a new red one from the donation pile. "This one's yours," I said. Her eyes widened. "Really, really?" She slipped it on her face, glowing, and before I could stand up, she wrapped her arms around my waist. "Thank you," she whispered. For a moment I couldn't speak. My throat burned. I held her for a long time as the sound of rain faded into the background. When I finally stepped outside again, the yard was alive. Steam rising from the food trays, lights flickering across smiling faces. Olivia caught my hand and whispered, "It's working." I nodded, blinking back tears. Mr. Harris clinked a spoon against his glass. The crowd quieting as he stood, his voice carried easily deep and steady. "Christmas used to be something we watched from a distance," he began. "We'd see the lights, hear the music, but it never belonged to us. Tonight, thanks to this woman." He glanced at me. "It does. Tonight, we're reminded that kindness doesn't have a price tag." Applause filled the air, rough and genuine. I bowed my head, unable to stop the smile that spread across my face. The band started playing again, this time louder, livelier. Volunteers moved between tables, refilling plates. Hannah danced with one of the guests, laughing so hard she nearly tripped. Olivia handed out small gift bags filled with blankets and gloves. I caught Miles filming quietly, the red light on his camera blinking like a heartbeat. Inside, the TV crew had set up a live stream. The broadcast title glowed across the bottom of the screen, "Real Christmas in Santa Monica." Comments poured in faster than anyone could read. "This is beautiful. Faith in humanity restored. We need more of this." By 7 o'clock, we were trending nationwide. Shapped Reel. Christmas #Grace. Whitmore. Togetherness. I didn't notice the rain had stopped until I looked up and saw the reflection of the lights in the puddles at my feet. The air was cold, but clear now. The kind of cold that wakes you up, not punishes you. And somewhere, hundreds of miles away, in a warm dining room in Napa Valley, another table was watching the same scene unfold. My parents were having Christmas Eve dinner with their friends, glasses of expensive wine half full. On the wall-mounted TV behind them, the headline caught Helen's attention. First, local woman transforms mansion into Christmas haven for the homeless. Robert, she said, softly. He looked up, frowning. What is it? Just look, she whispered. The footage played me standing in the yard smiling as I handed a plate of food to an elderly man. The reporter's voice narrated, while her family declined to comment. Grace Whitmore's efforts have drawn national praise for their sincerity and spirit. My father's hand went for the remote. Turn that off. But Helen caught his wrist. Wait. He froze. The sound filled the room. The laughter, the music, the voices thanking me. Helen's eyes welled as the camera zoomed in on my face. Robert, she said again. Her voice shaking. Look at her. He didn't answer. He just stared at the screen. I was on the TV now, laughing with the little girl in the red coat, the hope tree glowing behind me. The reporter added, when asked why she decided to open her home, Whitmore said, because peace isn't quiet, it's shared. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. Helen's tears fell freely. She's happy, she whispered. Really happy. Robert didn't speak. His reflection shimmered faintly in the wineglass, pale and still. Back in Santa Monica, I stood under the twinkling lights watching my guests sing along to a carol. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was trying to prove anything. I just felt present, whole. When you come home to yourself. And maybe that's what Christmas was always meant to be. Not a stage, not a performance, but a reminder that love only matters when it's shared. Somewhere deep inside me, I felt the ache of what I'd lost fade into something softer. Something almost like peace. The morning after Christmas Eve always felt like silence after a storm. The sky over Santa Monica was clear, washed clean from the night's rain, and the sunlight poured through the glass windows soft and golden. The house still smelled of cinnamon wine and roasted turkey. Wrapping paper and stray ribbons lay scattered across the floor. A few candles still flickered low on the dining table, their wax hardened at the edges. I moved slowly, stacking plates, folding tablecloths, the quiet of the house, wrapping around me like a blanket. Every corner still carried echoes from the night before. The laughter, the music, the voices saying thank you over and over. Then outside I heard the sound of tires crunching over wet gravel. A car door shut, then another. I looked through the window and my heart gave a single steady beat. My parents' car. Robert and Helen Whitmore were standing at the gate, Laura a few steps behind them. They looked smaller somehow, unsure, their usual poise dimmed by something heavier than pride. My first instinct was to freeze, but I didn't. I opened the door. Good morning, I said, my voice even. Helen hesitated. May we come in? Of course, I said, stepping aside. They entered cautiously like guests who weren't sure they belonged there. The hope tree still glowed in the living room, its white cards swaying gently in the morning breeze that slipped through the open windows. The ornaments sparkled against the sunlight. My mother's eyes moved slowly from the table to the couch to the decorations. You did all this, she asked, voice trembling. For them, I smiled. I just did what I used to do for you. The only difference is, they appreciated it. Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked around the room again, her hand brushing one of the chairs as if testing whether any of it was real. Robert stood silent, his hands in his coat pockets, surveying everything like a man trying to understand a language he'd never learned. Then his eyes landed on someone in the corner. Mr. Harris, sitting quietly at the dining table sipping coffee. The two men froze. Recognition crossed both their faces, quick but unmistakable. Mr. Harris stood smoothing his jacket. Merry Christmas, Robert. My father stiffened. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed. He took a small step backward, his shoulders rising defensively. Leonard, he said, finally. Barely above a whisper. Didn't expect to see me here, did you? Mr. Harris's tone wasn't cruel, just calm, like a man stating a fact after carrying it too long. Robert's face flushed. He glanced at me, his voice faltering. You invited him. I did. I said simply, "He was part of the story you left unfinished." For a long moment, no one spoke. You could hear the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel, the slow drip of rainwater from the gutters outside. My father lowered his gaze, the tension in his body softening. "I suppose he deserves to be here," he said finally. "I suppose he does," I replied. Something in the room shifted then, not forgiveness yet, but the space for it. Helen took a shaky breath, her voice barely steady. "Grace, all those people last night, you did that on your own." "With help," I said. "But yes." She looked around again, her eyes landing on a photograph Miles had left for me, a print from the event showing the little girl in her red coat hugging me under the hope tree. Helen reached out and touched the edge of the frame. Her voice cracked. "You did what we never could." I shook my head. "No, Mom. I did what you taught me to do. You just forgot somewhere along the way." Her eyes filled with tears. She moved toward me, hesitated for a second, then threw her arms around me. The familiar scent of her perfume hit me all at once, and for a moment I was a child again, standing in her arms, believing love could fix anything. "We were wrong," she whispered. "All this time, we thought peace meant keeping up appearances, but you showed us it's something else entirely." I held her tightly, my voice barely audible. "I know, Mom." When she stepped back, her mascara had smudged, and she didn't bother to fix it. Laura had been standing quietly the whole time, wiping her own tears with the back of her sleeve. "Dad," she said, gently turning to him. Robert didn't answer. He was still looking at the hope tree, his eyes on one card in particular, the one written by Mr. Harris. "I wish for a second chance." He read it twice, his expression unreadable. Then he turned toward Mr. Harris. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice rough. "I am sorry. I let fear make decisions I should have owned." Mr. Harris nodded. "That's enough. No grand forgiveness, no dramatic gesture. Just two men, a quiet acknowledgement, and the soft hum of redemption in the air." We all ended up sitting at the dining table, the four of us, surrounded by the remnants of the feast, crumbs of pie, half-empty glasses, wax from melted candles. For the first time in years, there were no raised voices, no hidden barbs, just silence, and it was good silence. The kind that felt like breathing again after holding it too long. My father broke it first, looking around the table. "You used to set the table this way when you were a kid," he said. "Even when no one came." I smiled faintly. "Some habits are hard to break." Helen reached out, placing her hand over mine. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Outside sunlight streamed through the windows, glinting off the wet pavement. Inside it caught the edge of the crystal glasses, scattering light across the room. It looked like a blessing, even if none of us said it out loud. We stayed like that for a while. Four people who had spent too long pretending, now finally learning how to sit together without needing to. Maybe we weren't fixed. Maybe we never would be. But for the first time we were real. And maybe that was enough. A week after Christmas, Los Angeles woke up to a rare kind of calm. The air was clear, the sky a pale blue that made everything below it seem sharper, more alive. I was in the kitchen pouring coffee when my phone started buzzing nonstop. Hannah's text came first. "Front page boss. You might want to grab a copy before the neighbors do." I walked out to the porch in my robe, the concrete still damp from an early drizzle. A small bundle of newspapers sat by the gate, wrapped in thin plastic. I tore it open, and there it was, my face on the front page of the Los Angeles Herald, the real meaning of togetherness. "Woman turns her mansion into a Christmas miracle." The photo was from Christmas Eve. Me laughing between two of our guests, a little girl in her red coat tugging at my sleeve. The caption underneath read, "Grace Whitmore's simple act of generosity becomes a symbol of community and compassion." For a long time, I just stared at it. The image didn't look like me, not the version I'd tried to be all those years. It wasn't polished or posed. It was real. Inside the phone kept ringing. Olivia. Then a call from a producer in New York. Then another from a charity foundation in San Diego. Everyone wanted to talk to partner, to film something, to ask how I'd done it. I answered only one call. "Miles Grant. Congratulations," he said. I could hear the smile in his voice. "You've broken the internet. Not sure that was the goal," I said. "It never is," he replied. "But it's what happens when something genuine hits people where they live." He paused. "Everyone's calling you the symbol of kindness. How does that feel?" I laughed softly. Strange. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just opened my door. He was quiet for a moment. Sometimes that's all it takes, he said. Most people don't. When I hung up, I stood by the window looking out toward the street where the hope tree still shone faintly through the glass. Reporters had asked if I'd keep it up through New Year's. I told them yes. Some things are meant to stay lit a little longer. Across town, Karen Douglas wasn't having such a good morning. The same papers that praised me had printed a sidebar titled "Local Business Owners' Complaints Backfire." Her restaurant was suddenly empty. Social media tore her apart. For once, the public outrage wasn't mine to bear. By afternoon, Evan and Laura stopped by with a copy of the paper tucked under Laura's arm. They were both smiling like proud siblings. "Front page," Evan said, handing me the paper again as if I hadn't seen it. "Guess you showed them what real PR looks like." Laura elbowed him lightly. "Don't make her blush." Then she turned to me. "Mom framed that picture in her study." I blinked. "She did. She said it reminds her of the first time you decorated the house by yourself. Only this time you didn't need anyone's approval." That hit deeper than I expected. Later that evening, after they left, I sat alone with the quiet. For years I'd lived on the edge of needing to explain myself, to my parents, to the world, even to my own reflection. For the first time, I didn't feel that pull. For the first time in my life, people were talking about me, and I didn't feel the need to defend a single word. When you stop explaining yourself, the silence becomes a kind of peace. Meanwhile, across the city, another scene was unfolding. My father's car pulled up in front of St. Agnes Church. The sun was low, washing the steps in gold. He climbed out slowly, his hands gripping the steering wheel for an extra second before letting go. Inside, Father Michael was lighting candles by the altar when he looked up. "Robert," he said with quiet surprise, "haven't seen you in a long time." My father nodded, his voice low. "I came because I've been carrying something too long. I think I'd like to put it down." The priest gestured toward a pew. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Robert spoke again. "I want to make things right, with someone I wronged a long time ago." Father Michael smiled gently. "Then you already have by coming here. Outside, Mr. Harris was sweeping the walkway, the broom scraping softly against the concrete. When Robert stepped out of the church, their eyes met. No one said anything at first. Then Harris set the broom aside and nodded. "Beautiful service," he said. Robert returned the nod, his voice unsteady. "Merry Christmas, Leonard." Harris smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need to be forgiven to forgive. "Merry Christmas, Robert." My father walked to his car, the winter light fading behind him. Inside, he reached for the passenger seat and picked up something wrapped in an old envelope. A Christmas card I'd made when I was 10. The front was hand-painted in crooked gold letters. "Peace begins at home." He turned it over, reading the childish scrawl on the back. "Love you, Dad. Don't ever stop making magic." His hand trembled slightly as he held it. When he got home, Helen was sitting in the living room, a fire burning low. She looked up when he walked in. "Did you find what you needed?" she asked softly. He sat down beside her, still holding the card. "I think so." She reached over, took his free hand, and intertwined their fingers. Neither of them spoke again. They didn't need to. The flames crackled softly. Outside, rain began to fall again, slow and gentle, washing the city clean one more time. Forgiveness doesn't rewrite the past. It just loosens its grip long enough for the present to breathe. Spring arrived early that year. The air in Santa Monica carried the faint scent of salt and wildflowers, and the ocean shimmered like glass under a soft blue sky. The city was alive again, but quieter somehow, as if even the waves had decided to breathe slower. On the corner of Ocean Avenue and Montana, the sign for Grace Haven had just gone up, a simple white building with open windows, sunlight streaming through. The words were painted in gold, clean and calm. A space for learning community and new beginnings. Inside, laughter echoed off the freshly painted walls. Olivia stood by the front counter, reviewing a schedule with 2 volunteers, while Hannah arranged cooking utensils on long tables in the kitchen. The air smelled like fresh bread and hope. Today was opening day. I stood by the entrance watching as people wandered in, some familiar faces from Christmas, others new, drawn by curiosity or the promise of change. Each person signed in with their name, and beside it, their dream. Find work. Learn to cook. Start over. Laura arrived mid-morning with her son Tyler, a bright-eyed 10-year-old who immediately started stacking chairs taller than himself. We'll help with setup, she said, smiling. Thanks, I said. You two might just become our first official volunteers. She grinned. Don't tempt me. Mom already told me she's baking something for the lunch program. Right on cue, Helen appeared at the door, balancing a large tin of pastries. I thought cinnamon rolls might make people feel welcome, she said. Her voice was softer now, like every word carried intention. Robert followed her, carrying 2 boxes of coffee cups. He didn't say much, just gave me a quiet nod before setting them on the table. Seeing them there, working side by side, surrounded by people they never would have noticed a year ago, felt like something I'd never dared to imagine. As the morning went on, Olivia gathered everyone for introductions. Welcome to Grace Haven, she said, her voice warm and confident. This is more than a center. It's a community. Everyone here has something to teach and something to learn. We clapped, and I felt my chest swell with something between pride and humility. When the first class began, a basic cooking workshop led by Hannah. I slipped out for a moment, walking down the hallway. The walls were lined with framed photos. There was the Hope Tree from that night, the little girl in her red coat, the headline from the Herald, "Togetherness is the new tradition." Each picture told a story I hadn't realized I was writing at the time. I stopped at one photo in particular, me standing at the gate shaking hands with our guests on Christmas Eve. I remembered how it felt, the cold air, the fear, the joy, the uncertainty. I smiled. Not bad for someone who used to be afraid of noise, I whispered. When I turned, I saw Mr. Harris walking toward me. He was almost unrecognizable from the man I'd met on that park bench months ago. His posture was straight, his hair trimmed neatly, his clothes crisp. You clean up well, I said, smiling. He laughed. Turns out people treat you differently when you start treating yourself that way. He looked around the hall, eyes glinting. I wanted to thank you, he said. Because of you, I got a job, teaching again part-time at the community college, and my son reached out last week. His voice wavered slightly. I think I get to be a father again. I felt a lump rise in my throat. That's incredible, Leonard. You did that. He shook his head. No, you reminded me it wasn't too late to try. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded note. I thought you'd like to have this. It was one of the old wish cards from the Hope Tree. The one that read, I wish for a second chance. He'd written underneath it in neat blue pen, granted. I laughed softly. I'll frame it. He smiled and offered his hand. I took it, his grip warm and steady. Then he nodded toward the window where the Pacific gleamed through the glass. You built something that will outlive a headline, he said. That's rare these days. As he left, I stood by the window, the sunlight washing over everything. The hallways, the laughter, the smell of baking bread drifting in from the kitchen. A breeze pushed through the open doors, carrying the sound of waves. Outside, cherry blossoms from the nearby park fluttered past the window, their petals catching the light. Last year, I had been erased from my own family's table. This year, I had built one no one could be excluded from. The thought came to me softly without bitterness. When you stop fighting to belong, you make room for belonging to find you. Helen appeared beside me, brushing flour from her hands. It's beautiful, she said quietly. All of it. I turned to her. So are you, Mom? She smiled, and in that look, tired, teary, but at peace, I saw everything that had shifted between us. No grand apologies, just understanding. Robert joined her, handing me a cup of coffee. You'll need fuel, he said gruffly. I took it, laughing. Still trying to manage me, Dad? Just staying useful, he said, but his eyes softened as he looked around. You've done good, Grace. Thanks, I said. We all did. He nodded once, the sunlight catching in his silver hair. The afternoon moved gently. Laughter filled every corner of the building, the sound of knives on cutting boards, the hiss of coffee machines, the easy rhythm of people working together. It wasn't perfect. It was better. It was real. When the crowd began to thin, and the day turned gold, I stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cool, the sky stretched wide above the glittering ocean. I leaned on the railing, breathing it in. Peace isn't when people leave you alone. It's when you're strong enough to love them anyway, even when they don't understand it. The door creaked behind me. Olivia's voice called, We're heading out soon. You coming? In a minute, I said. She smiled and closed the door. I stayed there watching the sun sink toward the horizon, petals drifting like snow around me. The past year had taken everything I thought I needed, and given me everything I actually did. If you've ever been left out of something you thought was yours, maybe the universe wasn't rejecting you, it was making space for what was waiting to arrive. You just have to be brave enough to open the door.